Nathaniel Covington was 36 years old, and until the day he drove home from his final overseas deployment, he believed his marriage was the one thing in his life built on solid ground. 12 years as a Navy SEAL had taken him away from home more than he wanted, but every dollar he sent back, every missed holiday, every 11-month stretch of silence, he endured because Brianna was waiting. Because Dominic Ashford, his best friend since they were 11 years old, had a key to the house for emergencies. What Nate found when he walked through his own front door was not an emergency. It was a note, handwritten, casual, the kind a man leaves when he is very comfortable in a place that does not belong to him. And then Dominic made the mistake that would cost him everything. He looked at the man he had been stealing from for 14 months and decided he could intimidate him. He stepped forward. He issued a challenge. He had no idea who he was standing in front of. What happened in that driveway took 11 seconds. What came after would take everything Dominic had left. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the suburban Atlanta streets as Nathaniel Covington guided his rental car through familiar neighborhoods. 11 months felt both like yesterday and a lifetime. The disciplined rhythm of deployment had a way of warping time like that. Now, finally home, he felt the weight of his service gear replaced by the simple presence of civilian clothes and the promise of permanence. He observed everything with the quiet attention that 12 years as a SEAL had burned into his muscle memory. Children's bikes left in driveways, sprinklers creating rainbow mists in golden light, a woman walking her dog, who smiled and waved as he passed. This was the life he had worked so hard to build a place in. The rental car's air conditioning hummed softly as his mind drifted to Brianna. 8 years of marriage, most of it spent apart, but somehow they had made it work. He remembered the day they met at his cousin's backyard cookout, her laugh carrying across the yard, full-bodied and genuine. She had been wearing a yellow sundress, her confidence radiating like sunshine. At 27, he had never met anyone so sure of themselves, so completely at ease in their own skin. Every deployment, every mission, every dollar saved, it had all been for them, for the life they were building. The 4-bedroom house he had renovated with his own hands during a rare extended leave 3 years ago stood as physical proof of his commitment. The modern fixtures she loved, the open floor plan she had sketched out, even the garden beds he had built to her exact specifications. Every detail was an investment in their future. As he turned onto their street, memories of that renovation summer filled his mind. The satisfaction of stripped floors and fresh paint. Brianna bringing him ice-cold lemonade, her hair tied up in a messy bun, stealing kisses between projects. It felt good to be coming home to something so solid, so carefully constructed. The first thing he noticed was Dominic's silver Audi in the driveway. The sight of it didn't immediately trigger any concern. Dominic had been a constant in their lives since they were 11 years old, running wild in their Augusta neighborhood. They had grown up together, shared everything from school lunches to life milestones. When Nate had deployed the first time, he had given Dominic a key to the house, trusting him to keep an eye on things, to be there for Brianna if she needed anything. Nate parked behind the Audi, grabbed his duffel from the back seat, and approached the house with the silent steps that had become second nature. The late afternoon light streamed through the front windows, casting warm rectangles on the hardwood floors he had installed himself. The house smelled like coffee and the lavender candles Brianna loved. The kitchen drew his attention first, not because of any sound, but because of the quiet. 2 coffee mugs sat on the granite counter, still warm to the touch when he placed his hand against the ceramic. Brianna's reading glasses lay next to her open planner, the pages covered in her neat handwriting. But it was another handwriting that made him pause. Bold block letters in black ink that he would recognize anywhere. Sunday. Same time. I'll bring dinner. D. Nate stood completely still, reading those words again. The casualness of it. The comfortable certainty. This wasn't the note of someone stopping by to check on a friend's wife. This was the note of someone who had claimed space, who expected to return, who knew his presence was anticipated and welcomed. With the same precise movement he used to document target locations, Nate took out his phone and photographed the note. He adjusted the planner to sit exactly as he had found it, positioned the reading glasses at the same angle. Nothing disturbed, nothing revealed. In the guest bathroom, he ran cold water and splashed it over his face, looking at himself in the mirror. His reflection showed what it always did. A man of contained emotion, of measured response, of careful calculation. 12 years of SEAL training had taught him that initial reactions rarely served good purposes. Intelligence gathering came first. Always. He dried his face with a hand towel, hung it back perfectly straight, and walked out of his house with the same silence he had entered it. The rental car started with a quiet purr. He backed out of his driveway, past Dominic's Audi, and pointed the car toward the Marriott he had passed on his way in. His phone sat heavy in his pocket. Brianna's number, the one he had texted daily for 8 years, remained untouched. In his hotel room, still in his travel clothes, Nate held the phone in his hand, not calling his wife, not moving, just sitting in the growing darkness as the sun set over Atlanta. The morning light filtered through the hotel curtains, finding Nathaniel Covington already awake, sitting at the small desk with a notepad in front of him. He had slept maybe 3 hours, but his mind was clear. The list he had made during the night was precise, methodical, exactly what anyone who knew him would expect. No emotional outbursts, no desperate scribbling, just clean, numbered objectives, written in his characteristic block letters. He picked up his phone and called Victor Reyes. Their shared history meant the conversation could be brief, efficient. Victor had been there through the worst firefights, the longest stakeouts, the most delicate extractions. He knew how to read between Nate's words. "I need eyes on my house for the next 48 hours, Nate said when Victor answered. Quiet, professional. There was a brief pause on the other end. Victor, who had developed an entire security consulting business with Nate after their SEAL days, understood immediately that something was wrong. But he also understood that if Nate wanted to explain more, he would have. "Already moving," Victor replied simply. "I'll handle it personally. Appreciate it." Nate ended the call. He showered, dressed in clean civilian clothes, and waited until 10:30 a.m., when he knew Brianna would be teaching her morning class at the boutique fitness studio she co-owned. The drive back to his house felt different in daylight, more real somehow. He parked in the driveway this time, used his key, and entered through the front door like any husband would. The house was silent. Morning dishes were dried and put away. The coffee maker was clean. Everything looked normal, which made what he was about to do feel even more surreal. But Nate moved through the space with purpose, his SEAL training converting an emotional mission into tactical objectives. In the master bedroom, he noticed small changes first. The arrangement of pillows slightly different from how he remembered. The reading lamp on his side of the bed angled away from where he used to position it. The nightstand drawer, his drawer, opened smoothly, revealing its contents like evidence at a crime scene. His belongings, the small box of cufflinks his mother had given him, his spare reading glasses, the worn paperback he had been reading before his last deployment, had been cleared out. He found them in a cardboard box on the top shelf of the closet, tucked behind his winter coats. The box wasn't hidden exactly. It was stored, like artifacts from a previous tenant. The drawer's new contents told their own story. A sleek silver watch he recognized as Dominic's latest status purchase. A charging cable, not the standard iPhone type Nate used, but the newer USB-C kind. A bottle of cologne, The expensive kind Dominic had always favored, the scent both familiar and now suddenly foreign in this context. Nate photographed everything meticulously. The drawer's contents, their arrangement, the box in the closet. Each image was a piece of intelligence, carefully documented. When he was done, he returned everything exactly as he had found it. In his line of work, disturbing a target area was amateur. Information gathering required patience, precision, and absolutely no traces. He left the house exactly as he had entered it and drove his rental to the end of the block, parking where he had a clear view of the driveway, but wouldn't draw attention from passing neighbors. The tactical part of his brain noted sight lines, observation angles, potential blind spots, all while another part of him sat with the weight of what he had just discovered. 40 minutes passed. Then the silver Audi appeared. Turning onto their street with familiar ease, Dominic stepped out, looking every bit the successful business developer he had become. Tailored suit, confident stride, moving with the casual ownership of someone who knew exactly where he belonged. The house key came out of his pocket without hesitation, a practiced movement. He didn't look around before entering. He didn't check to see if anyone was watching. He simply walked in like a man returning home from an errand. Nate sat in his truck for 8 full minutes after the door closed, his breathing steady, his face impassive. Then he drove back to the hotel. That evening, his phone buzzed with a text from Victor. A single image, timestamp 6:47 p.m. Dominic and Brianna standing in the driveway as the sun set. Dominic's arm draped casually around her shoulders, her body leaning into his with the comfortable familiarity of long practice. They weren't being careful. They weren't being secretive. They were simply being themselves, in the open, in Nate's driveway. Nate looked at the image for a long time, his face illuminated by the blue light of his phone screen as darkness settled over the hotel room. The morning sun cast long shadows across Nate's driveway as he pulled up behind Dominic's silver Audi. He sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel, taking in the familiar sight of his own home. The flower beds he'd helped Brianna plant 3 summers ago, the fresh coat of paint on the shutters from last spring. Everything looked exactly as it should, which made the wrongness of the situation even more stark. He stepped out of his truck, his movements measured and deliberate. The weight of his house key felt different in his hand now, no longer a symbol of homecoming but a tool for confrontation. The lock turned smoothly, the door opening without a sound, old habits of quiet entry still ingrained from years of training. Dominic was standing in the living room, his back to the entrance as he looked at something on his phone. At the sound of footsteps, he turned, and for a fraction of a second, Nate saw something flash across his face. Guilt, perhaps, or calculation. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a slow, disbelieving smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nate, man, I didn't know you were back." Dominic's voice carried its usual charm, but there was an edge underneath it now, something tense and defensive. "It's my house, Dom." Nate's response was quiet, controlled. He remained near the doorway, his posture relaxed but alert, the stance of a man who had learned to read situations before they escalated. "Look, I know this might seem—" Dominic began, then shifted strategies mid-sentence. "You've been gone a long time, brother. Things aren't exactly what you might think. Tell me what I think." Nate's voice remained level, his eyes steady on his oldest friend's face. The tension in the room thickened. Dominic straightened to his full height, 6'3" to Nate's 5'11", and took a step forward. It was a move he'd used countless times in business negotiations, boardrooms, social situations where his physical presence could tip the scales in his favor. "You need to calm down before this goes somewhere you don't want it to go." The threat in Dominic's voice was clear now, all pretense of friendship dropping away. Nate studied him with the kind of silence that made other men nervous, the quiet of someone who had been in situations where the wrong word could get someone killed. "You're challenging me," he said finally. Not a question, a statement of fact. I'm saying you should think carefully. Dominic took another step closer, using his broader frame to loom over Nate. All right, Nate said, his voice still calm. Let's go outside. The driveway concrete was warm under the morning sun as they stepped out. Neighbors' houses stood quiet on either side. Witnesses Dominic hadn't thought to consider. He moved first, shoving both hands against Nate's chest, with enough force to stagger a normal man. Nate didn't stagger. What happened next took exactly 11 seconds. Not a brawl, not a fight. A precise sequence of movements honed through 12 years of SEAL training. Nate stepped inside Dominic's guard, redirected his momentum, and executed a takedown that was almost beautiful in its efficiency. No wasted energy, no dramatic flourishes, pure tactical problem-solving. Dominic found himself face down on the concrete, one arm pinned behind him at an angle that promised pain if he struggled. He couldn't move, could barely breathe. Above him, Nate wasn't even breathing hard. You chose this, Nate said quietly. Now you know. He released his hold and stepped back, watching as Dominic pushed himself up from the pavement. The larger man's face was flushed with humiliation, the arrogance replaced by something that looked like the beginning of real fear, the dawning realization that he had badly miscalculated. You have 1 hour, Nate said. Clear your things out of my nightstand and get off my property. He turned and walked back into the house, leaving Dominic standing in the driveway. In the kitchen, he pulled out his phone and dialed Aunt Gloria's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. I know you're home, baby, she said, before he could speak. There's more you need to hear. Nate stood in his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, listening to the concern in his aunt's voice. Through the window, he could see Dominic's Audi still in the driveway, its owner nowhere in sight. The morning sun streamed through the glass, highlighting dust motes in the air and casting long shadows across the tile floor he'd installed himself 3 years ago. The afternoon sun painted warm patterns across Gloria's front porch as Nate climbed the familiar steps. This house had been his sanctuary growing up, a place where homework got done, where Sunday dinners meant something, where photographs tracked the years in neat rows along the mantel. He could see his third-grade picture from where he stood. Gap-toothed grin. Crew cut that meant business even then. Gloria opened the door before he could knock. She always did. Come here, baby, she said, pulling him into a hug that smelled like vanilla extract and wisdom. Her frame was smaller than he remembered. Time had a way of doing that, but her eyes were sharp as ever when she pulled back to look at him. Let me feed you first, she said, already moving toward the kitchen. It wasn't a request. In Gloria's house, hard conversations happened on full stomachs. That was the rule. The kitchen was exactly as he remembered. Yellow curtains filtering the light. Copper pots hanging in their precise places. The gentle hum of a refrigerator that had probably earned retirement 3 times over. Gloria moved with practiced efficiency, pulling out containers of food she'd clearly prepared in advance. Sit, she instructed, setting a plate of chicken and dumplings in front of him. Eat while it's hot. Nate did as he was told, watching as his aunt settled across from him with her own plate. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the quiet clink of silverware and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. When both plates were nearly empty, Gloria folded her hands on the table. I've been watching, she said simply, and keeping track. She told him about Dominic's car, how it started appearing in that driveway 18 months ago, always on the same days of the week. Like clockwork, she said. Thursday evenings, Sunday afternoons, sometimes Saturday mornings early, before the neighborhood was really awake. She told him about the planning meetings Brianna hosted for the fitness studio, always during his deployments, always running late into the evening. Your lights would be on until midnight or later, Gloria said, and it was never groups of people leaving. Just his car, pulling out slow like he didn't want to make noise. Her voice grew quieter as she described a night last winter, how she'd driven by around 11, seeing all the lights on, and noticed Dominic's Audi in the garage. The door was partly down, like someone remembered halfway through that maybe they shouldn't be so obvious. That's when I knew it wasn't just friendship gone wrong. It was planning, calculating. Nate sat very still, absorbing each detail with the same careful attention he'd given mission briefings. Gloria's observations weren't emotional. They were precise, chronological, backed by specific dates and times she'd clearly been recording somewhere. Then she reached for his hand across the table. "But that's not all," she said. "3 months ago, Terrell called me. Terrell, Gloria's nephew who worked at Atlanta First Credit Union, where Nate and Brianna kept their joint accounts, where Nate's deployment pay was direct, deposited every month. He was troubled," Gloria continued. "Said he wouldn't normally say anything, but he loves you like a brother," and couldn't sleep right knowing what he was seeing. "He asked me if you knew about the cashier's checks." Nate's hand tightened slightly under hers. "What checks?" "Large withdrawals," Gloria said. "Regular ones, spread out over 14 months. Not going to the studio account." He checked that specifically. Going somewhere else entirely. She named a figure that made Nate's jaw tighten. 14 months. While he was deployed. While he was sending money home. While he was trusting completely. "I couldn't tell you overseas," Gloria said softly. "Couldn't risk that kind of distraction when you needed to be focused. But I kept everything. Dates, amounts, patterns. It's all written down." Nate nodded once. He understood. Both her protection and her precision. Gloria had always known exactly when truth would be most useful. 20 minutes later, he sat in his truck in Gloria's driveway as evening settled around him. His phone showed Victor's number, thumb hovering over the call button. The yard lights were coming on in neighboring houses, creating pools of yellow in the growing darkness. He pressed call. Victor answered on the second ring. "I need a complete financial trace," Nate said without preamble. "Joint accounts, withdrawal patterns, any new accounts opened in the last 18 months. Everything." "Parameters?" Victor's voice was steady, professional. "Atlanta First Credit Union. Start with cashier's checks dating back 14 months. Cross-reference against studio accounts." Nate paused. "And Victor?" "Look for Dominic Ashford's name on anything." "Copy that," Victor said. "I'll move on it now." The call ended. Nate sat in the gathering darkness, watching Gloria's porch light flicker on automatically. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at shadows. He waited for Victor's confirmation text, his truck a silent sentinel in the quiet neighborhood where he'd grown up, learning right from wrong. The morning light filtered through the blinds of their shared office as Victor laid out the financial documents across Nate's desk. Each page was annotated with yellow highlights and red flags. 14 months of systematic betrayal reduced to numbers and dates. $214,000, Victor said quietly, tapping the summary page. "Moved through 2 accounts we never knew existed." Nate studied the first account details. Opened in Brianna's name only, at a different bank than their joint account. Regular deposits, carefully timed to avoid attention. The second account hit harder. A joint account between Brianna and Dominic, structured for shared access and mutual benefit. The methodology was precise. Each withdrawal from their joint account had been calculated to stay just below the threshold that might trigger attention. Cashier's checks, mobile transfers, careful distribution across months to make it look like normal household management. "She used the deployment schedule," Nate said, his voice level as he traced the pattern with his finger. "The larger transfers happened while I was overseas, when she knew I wouldn't be checking statements." Victor nodded. "She had a system. Transfer money from your joint account to her private account first, then move portions to the account she shared with Dominic. Made it harder to track the full amount." Nate leaned back in his chair, absorbing the scope of it. This wasn't just an affair. This was architecture. While he was sending his deployment pay home faithfully, believing he was building their future, Brianna had been constructing an exit strategy, using his trust as the foundation. The money itself wasn't what cut deepest. It was the manipulation of his dedication. Every wire transfer he'd sent from overseas represented weeks of dangerous work, sleepless nights, and separation from home. All of it converted into seed money for another man's future with his wife. The studio was cover, Victor continued, spreading out another set of documents. She'd mention business expenses, equipment upgrades, legitimate-sounding reasons to move money. But we tracked the studio accounts separately. That money never went there. Nate picked up a bank statement, studying the dates. The first transfer coincided with his third-to-last deployment. While he was running missions in hostile territory, she was running parallel financial operations at home. The precision of it was almost admirable, in the coldest possible way. She didn't just betray the marriage, Nate said quietly. She weaponized it, used my absence to build infrastructure, used my trust to fund it. Victor watched his friend carefully. In 12 years of military service together, he'd never seen Nate truly rattled. Even now, facing documentation of such calculated personal betrayal, his exterior remained composed. But Victor knew what to look for: the slight tension in his jaw, the controlled rhythm of his breathing. "I need Dana Whitfield's number," Nate said finally, closing the folder. Victor pulled out his phone, already prepared. "She's expecting your call. I sent her office a preliminary summary this morning." She cleared her evening schedule. 4 hours later, Nate sat across from Dana Whitfield in her downtown office. The city lights were coming on outside her windows, creating a backdrop of urban geometry against the darkening sky. Dana moved through the documentation with clinical efficiency, her notepad filling with precise annotations. "Fraudulent concealment of marital assets," she said, looking up from the papers, "with clear evidence of systematic liquidation and intentional concealment. The joint account with Mr. Ashford particularly strengthens our position." She laid out the legal strategy with the same precision Victor had shown with the financial trace. Both Brianna and Dominic faced potential civil liability. Given the amount involved and the documented pattern of concealment, criminal exposure wasn't out of the question. "We'll file for divorce, citing financial fraud," Dana continued. "The asset concealment claims will be filed simultaneously. Mr. Ashford's involvement as a co-conspirator gives us additional leverage. His professional reputation becomes collateral damage the moment this hits public record." Nate watched the city move below them. Cars flowing through intersections, people walking with purpose, lives continuing in their ordinary rhythms while his own reality shifted on its axis. "How quickly can we move?" he asked. "I can have everything filed by Friday," Dana replied. "We'll coordinate service of process for maximum impact. Given the documentation you've provided, we're operating from a position of complete tactical advantage." Nate stood, gathering his copy of the files. The city continued its evening dance beyond the windows, unaware that in this quiet office, the mechanics of consequence were being set in motion. The evening settled over Atlanta like a warm blanket, streetlights casting gentle shadows across the familiar roads as Nate dialed Brianna's number. He let it ring twice before she answered, her voice carrying that practiced note of warmth she'd perfected over their years together. "I'm home," he said, keeping his tone light and even. "I thought maybe we could have dinner tonight. Just us. Talk about everything. Our future." There was a brief pause on the line, the sound of her considering, calculating. "Of course," she replied, matching his warmth. "I'll cook something special. 8 o'clock? Perfect," he said, and ended the call. The house looked exactly as it had when he'd left it that morning. Dominic's car notably absent from the driveway. Inside, Brianna had transformed their dining room into what she clearly imagined was a perfect setting for reconciliation. Candles flickered on the table, casting intimate shadows across the walls. The good china was set out, the wedding plates they rarely used. She'd even pulled out the crystal wine glasses, a wedding gift from his mother. She greeted him with a careful hug, her perfume familiar and deliberately applied. She'd chosen a dress he'd once complimented, her hair styled the way he preferred. Everything calculated for maximum effect. "I made your favorite," she said, leading him to the table. "The chicken with rosemary and those roasted potatoes you love." Nate settled into his chair, watching as she served the food with practiced grace. Her movements were fluid, confident, a performance she'd refined through countless dinner parties and social gatherings. She'd always known exactly how to present herself to any audience. "The studio must be keeping you busy," he said, cutting into the perfectly cooked chicken. "How's the new location search going?" Brianna launched into a detailed update about property viewings and permit applications. Nate listened carefully, noting how she avoided mentioning specific dates or financial details. She was good. Every statement technically true, but carefully curated to avoid revealing the full picture. "And your sister?" he asked, steering the conversation toward family. "How's she handling the new baby?" This drew out another stream of information. Family updates and social observations, all delivered with just the right amount of intimacy and casual detail. She was building a narrative of normal life, of stability and connection. If he hadn't seen the bank statements that morning, he might almost have believed it. They were halfway through dessert, a homemade chocolate cake that she knew he favored, when her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, a flicker of something crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "Sorry," she said, standing gracefully. "I need to take this. It's about the studio lease." She stepped onto the back porch, closing the door behind her. The kitchen windows were old, their seals worn from years of Atlanta weather. Nate didn't need to strain to hear her voice, carried clearly through the evening air. "No, not tonight," she said, her tone entirely different from the one she'd used with him, more intimate, more real. "He just got back. Give me 3 weeks. 3 weeks." The timeline was set. She wasn't navigating a complicated emotional situation. She was managing a project handover. Every dinner, every conversation, every careful performance was just running out the clock until she could execute her final transition. Nate took another bite of cake as she returned to the table, her smile back in place. "Everything okay with the lease?" he asked. "Just some paperwork details," she said smoothly. "Nothing that can't wait until morning." He finished his dessert, complimenting her cooking with just the right amount of appreciation. They discussed his plans for the security consulting firm, her upcoming studio expansion, a perfectly normal conversation between husband and wife, except for all the things they weren't saying. When he left, she hugged him again, holding on a moment longer than necessary. "I'm glad you're home," she said softly. He drove to the hotel in silence, the city lights blurring past his windows. In the parking lot, he pulled out his phone and dialed Dana's number. "Move everything up," he said when she answered. "File by Friday." "We can do that," Dana replied, professional and precise. "I'll have the papers ready tomorrow." He ended the call and sat in the dark parking lot, his hands steady on the steering wheel, the engine quiet. Through the windshield, he could see his reflection in the building's glass facade. A man who looked exactly like himself, even as everything around him shifted into its new reality. The morning sun painted sharp rectangles across Nate's hotel room desk as he methodically arranged the paperwork Dana had prepared. New account applications from 3 different banks lay in precise stacks, each requiring his signature. He worked through them with the same focused attention he'd given mission briefs. Thorough, deliberate, leaving nothing to chance. By 10 o'clock, he had established separate personal accounts at institutions with no connection to his joint finances with Brianna. The bank representatives, sensing something in his calm demeanor, processed everything with minimal questions. Within an hour, he had redirected his portion of the security consulting firm's income to accounts only he could access. His phone buzzed. Victor, sending another set of surveillance photographs. The images showed Dominic's car at the house during specific hours, timestamps clear, and metadata preserved. One photo captured Dominic carrying groceries through the front door using his own key. Another showed him collecting mail from their mailbox, casual as any resident. Victor had documented everything with military precision. Evidence of cohabitation, Dana had explained during their meeting, essential for establishing the pattern of deception and unauthorized access to marital property. Nate forwarded the photographs to Dana's office, then opened his contacts list. The calls he needed to make now were harder than any financial paperwork. He started with his mother. "Mom," he said when she answered, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen first." His mother's silence on the other end was immediate and complete. She had always known when to wait. "I'm filing for divorce," he continued, his voice steady. "You'll hear details soon, and they won't be simple. I wanted you to hear it from me first, before anyone else's version reaches you." His mother absorbed this with the quiet strength he'd inherited from her. "Are you sure?" she asked finally. "Yes." "Then that's what matters," she said. "The rest is just details." His brother took the news differently, a burst of protective anger that Nate had to carefully contain. "Not yet," he told him. "Let the process work. Let the truth do its job." The two family friends, people whose respect Brianna had carefully cultivated over years, were harder. They asked questions he wouldn't answer, offered support he didn't need, but he made the calls because they needed to hear his voice, needed to understand that this wasn't a rash decision or an emotional response. By early afternoon, Dana's office had filed for emergency freezing of the joint accounts pending divorce proceedings. The notification would hit Brianna's phone within hours. Nate imagined her reading it, watching her carefully constructed timeline collapse. The drive to Aunt Gloria's house felt different this time, less urgent, more grounded. She opened the door before he reached it, as if she'd been waiting. "Come in," she said, leading him to her kitchen table. "Sit with me a minute." The afternoon light filtered through her lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the familiar wooden surface. Gloria reached across and took both his hands in hers, her grip warm and sure. "You've done this exactly right," she said quietly. "No shouting, no drama, just the truth, delivered to the people who need to hear it." "I didn't want to give her time to spin it," Nate replied. "Once the papers are served—" "You let the truth do the talking," Gloria interrupted gently. "You just carry it to the right people. The rest takes care of itself." His phone buzzed as Gloria squeezed his hands one last time. Dana's message was brief and precise. "Papers filed. Process server scheduled for Tuesday morning at the studio. Everything in motion." That evening, Nate returned to his hotel room and methodically prepared for bed. The same routine he'd followed through years of deployment. Shower, check phone, set alarm. But tonight, as he lay in the unfamiliar bed, something had shifted. The machinery of consequence was now in motion, running on its own power. For the first time since seeing Dominic's note on that planner, his mind was quiet. He slept a full 8 hours, dreamless and deep, like a man who had set down a heavy weight and finally allowed himself to rest. The Tuesday morning sun had barely cleared the Atlanta skyline when two professionally dressed individuals entered Brianna's boutique fitness studio. The polished hardwood floors gleamed under track lighting, and the morning's first clients were checking in at the front desk where Brianna stood reviewing the day's schedule with her staff. The process servers approached with practiced efficiency. No dramatics, just clean professionalism. "Brianna Covington?" the woman asked, though she clearly knew the answer. Brianna's smile remained fixed in place as she answered, "Yes, that's me. These are for you." The woman extended a thick manila envelope. "You've been served." The moment stretched like pulled taffy as Brianna stared at the envelope, her manicured fingers frozen mid-reach. Around her, the carefully cultivated atmosphere of the studio, all gleaming equipment and ambient music, seemed to constrict. "You need to take it, ma'am," the male server said quietly. Brianna's hand finally closed around the envelope. The servers turned and left with the same efficiency with which they'd arrived, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Two early morning clients watched from the check-in area, their yoga mats tucked under their arms. A young staff member busied herself with reorganizing already neat towel stacks, deliberately not looking up. Brianna opened the envelope with steady hands, a studied composure that lasted exactly as long as it took her to read the first page. Her face drained of color as she processed the words "fraudulent concealment of marital assets" and "co-defendant Dominic Ashford." This wasn't just divorce papers. This was exposure. She excused herself to her office, closing the door with careful control. Within 20 minutes, her first voicemail landed on Nate's phone. "How dare you? You couldn't even talk to me first. You had me served at my business? In front of my staff? Call me back immediately." The second voicemail came 43 minutes later, the anger replaced by something closer to panic. "Nate, please, we need to discuss this. These allegations, this isn't what you think. You're making a mistake. Please call me back. Please." Nate listened to both messages from his office at the security consulting firm, his face impassive. He forwarded them to Dana with a brief text. Confirmation of service receipt. Her response was immediate. Documented. First hearing date set. The day proceeded with methodical normalcy. Nate attended 2 client meetings, reviewed security protocols for an upcoming event, and had lunch with Victor to discuss a new contract. It wasn't until evening that his phone lit up with Dominic's number. He answered on the third ring. "Yes? What the hell are you doing?" Dominic's voice carried none of its usual smooth confidence. "You're dragging me into your marital problems now?" The documentation speaks for itself. "Listen." Dominic's tone shifted to something more reasonable, more familiar. The voice he'd used to talk his way out of trouble since they were kids. "I know you're upset, but this, making it legal, making it public? We've known each other 30 years, man. We can work this out privately." "The accounts are already public record," Nate replied. "It was her money to move," Dominic tried. "I was just helping her protect herself. Bank records show the source of the funds." "For Christ's sake, Nate. We grew up together. We played Little League. Your mom used to feed me dinner. Are you really going to throw all that away? The civil exposure affects your professional licensing." A pause, then Dominic's voice hardened. "You really want to do this? Because once it starts, there's no going back. You might not like where this leads." Nate's response was calm, precise. "You co-signed accounts funded with money that wasn't hers to move. Your attorney will explain the rest." He ended the call and set the phone down on his hotel room desk. The city lights were coming on outside his window, office buildings transforming into constellations of fluorescent squares against the darkening sky. He walked to the kitchenette, filled a glass with water, and returned to stand at the window. Below him, Atlanta traffic moved in its usual patterns, headlights and brake lights flowing like red and white rivers. Somewhere out there, Dominic was probably already calling his lawyer. Brianna was likely still in her office, reading through the full filing. The machinery of consequence was turning, and neither of them could stop it now. Nate took a slow sip of water and watched the city lights shimmer against the gathering night. Gloria's house looked exactly as it had for 30 years, white clapboard siding, dark green shutters, and flower boxes beneath every window. Today those boxes overflowed with late summer blooms, a splash of color against the gathering storm clouds overhead. Nate arrived first, a manila folder tucked under his arm. He helped Gloria arrange chairs in her living room, enough for 8 people, positioned so everyone could see everyone else. The room still held the warmth of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, family photographs lining the walls like silent witnesses. His mother arrived next, quiet and composed. Then his brother Michael, who squeezed Nate's shoulder once before taking a seat. Two of Brianna's closest family friends, her Aunt Catherine and Cousin Rachel, came together, their faces carefully neutral. They had known Brianna since she was a teenager, had celebrated at her wedding, had believed in the life she portrayed. When Brianna's car pulled into the driveway, her sister Lauren was in the passenger seat. Through the window, Nate watched them sit for a moment, heads together in conversation. Lauren had always been Brianna's strongest defender, her most reliable ally in any dispute. They entered together, Brianna's chin held high despite the shadows under her eyes. She wore one of her studio outfits, expensive athletic wear that projected capability and control. Lauren's hand rested protectively on her sister's back. "Thank you all for coming," Nate said once everyone was seated. His voice was steady, pitched to carry without force. "I asked you here because you deserve to hear this directly from me, and Brianna deserves to hear it in person." He opened the manila folder and removed a single sheet of paper. The timeline was clean, professional, dates and events laid out in simple chronological order. No editorializing, no accusations, just facts. "I'm going to read this," he said. "I ask that everyone listen completely before speaking." He began with their wedding date, June 12th, 8 years ago. A beautiful ceremony in Aunt Catherine's backyard, string lights in the trees, Brianna radiant in her mother's restored dress. He moved through his deployments, dates, durations, locations when they weren't classified. Then came the financial record, wire transfers beginning 14 months ago. Dates, amounts, account numbers, Dominic's documented presence in the house, security camera timestamps, neighbor confirmations, Gloria's quiet observations, the systematic draining of their joint accounts, the strategic conversion of their shared life into portable assets. The room grew heavier with each precise detail. Lauren's protective posture began to crack. Aunt Catherine pressed her lips together. Brianna stared straight ahead, her face a mask of composure that slipped further with each new revelation. Nate's voice never wavered. He wasn't performing grief or anger. He was simply speaking truth into a room that needed to hear it. When he finished reading, he set the paper down and looked directly at Brianna for the first time since she'd arrived. "I don't hate you," he said quietly. "I've already done my grieving, privately and without audience. What happens now isn't revenge. It's simply the natural consequence of choices you made with full awareness and deliberate intent." Lauren had stopped defending, stopped trying to catch Brianna's eye. Nate's mother hadn't moved or spoken, but her silence carried the weight of maternal disappointment. The room held its breath. "Thank you for your home, Aunt Gloria," Nate said, standing. The movement was smooth, unhurried. He picked up his folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked to the door without looking back. The screen door closed behind him with a soft click. His boots crunched on the gravel driveway, marking a steady rhythm to his truck. The key slid into the ignition. The engine turned over with a familiar rumble. Behind him, Gloria's house stood solid and unchanged, holding the aftermath of truth inside its walls. The first drops of rain began to fall as Nate pulled away, leaving thin, dark spots on the windshield that grew and merged as he drove into the gathering storm. He did not check his rearview mirror. He did not need to see what he was leaving behind. The weight he'd carried for weeks had lifted, not in triumph or satisfaction, but in the quiet relief of finally setting down something heavy in exactly the right place. The rain fell harder as he turned onto the main road, washing the world clean behind him. 8 months had passed, like water moving steadily downstream. Morning light filtered through the single window of Nate's new condo, catching dust motes in its beam as he stood at his kitchen counter, coffee in hand. The space was deliberately smaller than the house had been. 2 bedrooms instead of 4, no formal dining room, just enough room for what he needed now. The walls were still mostly bare, waiting for the right things to fill them. He unfolded the business section of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, more out of habit than interest, but a familiar name caught his eye. Dominic Ashford had withdrawn his bid for partnership at Coleman & Ross, one of the city's premier business development firms. It was the second such withdrawal in 3 months. The article didn't mention the civil judgment. It didn't have to. In Atlanta's business circles, that kind of public record traveled on its own current. Nate had heard through mutual connections that Dominic's mother Phyllis had stopped hosting her monthly social luncheons. She'd been cornered at a charity auction by well-meaning friends asking about that unfortunate business with the Covington lawsuit, and found herself without the right words to explain away her son's reduced circumstances. For a woman who had built her identity on her son's ascent, watching him contract rather than expand had been its own kind of judgment. Dominic himself had grown quieter, less visible at industry events. He wasn't ruined in any dramatic sense. He still had his base salary, his silver Audi, his downtown apartment. But he was diminished, operating at a lower voltage, and for a man who had constructed himself entirely around being significant, that reduction cut deeper than any financial penalty could have. The paper also carried a small notice about changes in ownership at Pure Form Fitness, the boutique studio Brianna had co-founded. The forced restructuring, triggered by the asset recovery proceedings, had left her business partner Angela with controlling interest while Brianna's share underwent partial recovery. Angela had managed to distance herself effectively, framing it as an internal reorganization rather than a legal necessity. Brianna had moved to a garden apartment in Buckhead. Nice enough, but a clear step down from the house she'd shared with Nate. Her carefully curated social media presence had grown sparse, then sporadic, then almost silent. The last anyone had heard, she and Dominic had tried briefly to build something real from the foundation of their deception, but it had crumbled under the weight of consequence and mutual resentment. Nate set the paper aside and rinsed his coffee cup. His own life had expanded along different lines. The security consulting firm he ran with Victor had landed a significant federal contract, allowing them to hire 4 new employees and open a second office in Virginia. The work was steady, challenging in the right ways, built on the foundation of trust he and Victor had established in more dangerous contexts. In his spare time, Nate had taken up woodworking. His garage workspace held basic tools and a growing collection of practice pieces, some good, some clearly showing the learning curve of a new craft. He approached it with the same patience he brought to everything, understanding that skill came from repetition, that mistakes were necessary teachers, that rushing produced nothing worth keeping. That morning, he'd had breakfast with Aunt Gloria at their usual diner. She'd studied his face over her coffee cup, noting the ease in his shoulders, the quiet focus in his eyes. "How do you feel?" she'd asked, not for the first time, but with fresh weight in the question. Nate had considered it carefully, the way he considered everything. "Like myself again," he'd said finally. "Like I got back to something." Gloria had nodded, understanding what he meant, that he'd returned not just to himself, but to the truth of who he'd always been. The man who moved deliberately, who built things to last, who understood that patience was its own kind of power. Now, in his garage workshop, afternoon light slanted through the single window, catching sawdust in its beam. Nate ran his hand along the edge of the coffee table he was building, feeling for rough spots that needed attention. His phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from Victor about a new contract opportunity, something significant that would need discussing early next week. Nate glanced at the notification, then set the phone back down without opening it. He picked up his sanding block and returned to the table's surface, moving with careful attention along the grain. The wood would tell him what it needed if he listened well enough. Outside, cars passed on the street, carrying people through their own stories. Inside, there was just the steady rhythm of sandpaper on wood, dust catching light, and the quiet certainty that some things couldn't be rushed. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.